shows. It means the screenshot shows whatever you change.
Up next we have Dan Skaggs.
There's a taskbar. Upload, it makes you do it, so you can't skip it. You could send it in sound upload it to thing.
Hi guys, I'm Dan Skaggs, or as folks that know me on the radio know me by is amateur radio station November 4 Echo Alpha. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit tonight about amateur radio's role in emergency communications as it exists in the different agencies we serve. Now, if I mention amateur radio to you, a lot of you are going to have a picture kind of like this in mind, right? Well, my grandpa did that. That's kind of old and busted. We got Facebook. Or you might have an image like this. Well, these guys are breathing a lot too much of the smoke coming off their soldering iron, and they like their toys a little too much. Well, before we can really say what amateur radio is, in between, we have to talk about a couple of folks that are integral to our history. And the first one is Samuel Morse. And you guys heard these. You know, he's the father of the Morse code, the language of radio and such. And so that really enabled the amateur crew to get messages across the air with very little effort. And Mr. Marconi, which I can't pronounce his first name, so we're just going to go with is widely thought to be the father of wireless communications and is the first person that was credited with having a successful cross-Atlantic transmission received. So if we talk about what amateur radio is, the first thing is it's really a hobby. Might come to some surprise to you guys, but most ham radio operators like to talk. Yeah, we talk all over the world, talk around the corner, around the U.S., whatever. If somebody's on there, we'll talk to them. It really doesn't matter. And in addition to being a hobby, it's also an experimental phase. These gals here have a circularly polarized UHF antenna that they're attempting to listen to signals from the International Space Station. Between Mr. Marconi and World War II, most of the advances in electronics came about because of amateur radio operators experimenting and burning stuff up in their basement. It's also an awards arena. We call these guys paper chasers. Well, I've talked to somebody in every state, or I've talked to somebody on every continent, talked to somebody in 100 countries, etc., etc. There's all these different sponsored awards for doing X with talking to folks and getting confirmation of contacts. He's also got a competitive arm to this thing too. This is a friend of mine, Kirk Pickering, K4RO, lives in Tennessee, and his contest station where he sometimes sits for 48 hours at a time and talks to upwards of 10,000 people in 48 hours. He's crazy, but he's good. We also have some other crazy folks that go to far-off places and set up to help us paper chasers get contact with places that aren't normally on the air. This particular picture was taken at Peter Island, which is off the coast of Antarctica. They made 88,000 contacts in 2 weeks, and I was lucky enough to get to work them at least once. We've also got a little bit of civil authority assistance, like we talked. We deal with health departments in like mass vaccination groups. We're often called to provide communications for marathons, volunteer labor for figuring out if there's a problem. That's a good thing, right? So all this is a hobby and it's fun until it's not. Amateur radio is chartered by the government to be a backup communication service in case it hits the fan, so to speak. And we work closely with various agencies from local to federal, and there are several organizations that have sprung up to make it easier for us to integrate. The most active one being Skywarn. Skywarn is a National Weather Service program that trains people like me, amateur radio operators, to be able to give accurate storm and weather information back to them so that they can verify or debunk what they're seeing on the radar. Normally what happens is each county has a centralized emergency operations center with a ham radio operator in it. And those of us that are throughout the county, whether at home or mobile, feed our reports into those folks, and then they coordinate getting them to the Weather Service, which I think is number 87, way up there at the top. And then the information reverse flow back to us as well. Another organization, Amateur Radio Emergency Services, has the job of basically moving into disaster areas where there are no communications into and out of. These mobile units that you see like this can do all kinds of communication channels into and out of areas that don't have any. And I apologize if there are any Louisiana folks that are having flashbacks, but this is the best thing I could come up with. During Hurricane Katrina, widespread power outages, cell phone networks overloaded. A lot of those mobile units went down and set up and was able to get health and welfare traffic into and out of the area. Now, in Middle Tennessee, we also had an influx of folks that were displaced by Hurricane Katrina that came up to stay in the Red Cross shelters. This was very sudden, and the Red Cross didn't have phone lines in their shelters, so they tasked us amateur radio operators to get communications between the shelters and the American Red Cross headquarters. MARE exercises are mass accident response exercises or events, depending on if it's real or not. These are usually between military and civilian first responders and amateur radio operators in the event of a train derailment, airplane crash, etc. We drill and practice those kinds of things. Once a year we have a whole weekend where we go and set up in weird places like parks and rivers, and some people you just notice, well, you can't see it on that slide, but there's a big jar of vodka on the table over there. And operate under emergency power conditions and non-home stations, so if something happens, we've got some practice in doing things from odd locations. Some people ask me, how do you know what you're doing? And a lot of that boils down to that the agencies that we deal with provide a lot of training because they get a very valuable service from us basically for free. We have other folks, Elm Ring is a ham radio term for mentoring. And so if you're kind of interested, you know, kind of what's going on, basically you got to have a license. This is not CB radio. You have to be licensed. You don't have to do code anymore. There are no age restrictions. Find your local club. There's the National Radio Club, and a bonus plus anybody can decode the Morse code.